Hello, hello. Hi.
Hi, Jongwoo.
Hey, Jose. What up?
TGIF, cheers.
Ooh, I have some sparkling water.
Just for now. Well, it's good to see you.
Great seeing you.
Yeah, so let me just say hello to our audience. My name is Jose Diaz. I'm the chief curator at the Andy Warhol Museum. And welcome to Queer Eye virtual tour of the Andy Warhol Foundation. You're going to join myself and Dr. Jongwoo Jeremy Kim of Carnegie Mellon University. And we're both visiting you live from Pittsburgh. We're really thrilled to walk you through Revelation. Queer Eye Tours take a look at an exhibition through the lens of queer identity, and it's a celebration of LGBTQ plus artists. So I thought we would get started if we can get our PowerPoint up. Thank you.
All right, can't wait. Let's do this.
Yeah, and Jongwoo, you've had the pleasure of seeing the show here in Pittsburgh, and I was fortunate enough to see it in Louisville. And so what I've done is, I know we're going to talk about selections for our audience at home, but I'm going to sort of walk us through. And so we can go to the next slide.
So we're going to walk through our heels, okay?
Yeah, there you go. So if you're actually in the Speed Museum this evening, or if you go this weekend, I encourage you to do so. This is the entrance of Andy Warhol Revelation. It's an exhibition that started here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And next slide, please. And the exhibition is a narrative of Andy Warhol and his Catholic upbringing. Andy Warhol is probably the most famous artist of the 20th century, at least the most famous American artist, and most people refer to him as the king of pop art. And this exhibition really surveys the Catholicism within his work. Andy Warhol was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was born in 1928, and his family, they're of Carpatho-Rusin heritage. The Carpatho-Rusin people are a people without a homeland. They're from a small town called Makova, which is in modern-day Slovakia. And there's a lot of Carpatho-Rusin people who settled here in Pittsburgh. And a lot of Carpatho-Rusin people are Byzantine Catholic faith. And what we can see there is a historical photo. It's the earliest known photo of Warhol's family church, St. John Chrysostom. Next slide, please. And that's the entrance, just to give you a sense. Jongwoo, follow me. Let's go to the next slide.
Ooh, yes.
Well, there's one section in the show that we start off with, and I'll start talking about this before I hand over to you. I like to talk about Andy Warhol's upbringing, his early years. He grew up in Pittsburgh in a neighborhood known as the Ruska Dolina, which is the Rusin Valley. He was very artistic as a young child, and his mother, Julia, she not only encouraged his faith, but she also encouraged his artistic side. She herself was a self-taught artist, and she ended up living with Andy for about 20 years after he had settled in New York City. So Andy Warhol studied at Carnegie Tech, which is Jongwoo, where you studied, or where you're working.
Oh, cartons.
Yeah. And so Andy would study
cards.
Andy would study pictorial design, and in 1949 moved to New York City. And what you see in the background there are some of his blotted line works. Next slide, please. And maybe you're not familiar with these works, but these works, they have a special technique that I know the Speed Art Museum has shown us in previous happy hours. It's sort of a simple printmaking technique. Andy would take on a lot of clients for commercial illustrations. You can see an example here. There's this nativity scene with beautiful gold leaf. Andy Warhol, because he was Byzantine Catholic and he had gone to church all his life, would have understood this nativity scene. But of course, this was actually made specifically for a holiday greeting card. Warhol loved the holidays. And the image on the right, that's just another sort of commission work that Warhol would have done for clients. In the 1950s, Warhol was so successful, he was making about $60,000 a year. He bought his first suit from Brooks Brothers, and so he was a very dapper dandy. And when he moved to New York City, next slide, please, he fell among a queer circle. You know, Andy Warhol is often thought of as being asexual, closeted. Some people think he was bisexual, but we know for a fact, and there's a new biography that just came out by Blake Gopnik, when he moved to New York in the 50s, he had a very queer circle. This is a photo from our archives that actually shows Andy in the middle. I don't know if you can see at home. He's laying on the bed. He lived with his mother. They had, at one point, they had, it's rumored that they had up to 25 cats, but that's been debunked since. But you can see Andy there with a cat, and there's a figure there that's Carlton Willers. That's considered Warhol's first boyfriend. And we know this is his home. If you look carefully, there's actually a blotted line butterfly work in one of the images in the center. But also Warhol hung out, next slide, please. Warhol also spent time creating very personal images. We call these the boy book drawings. The boy book drawings were intimate drawings. They weren't based off what a client wanted. They were actually all live sketches based off subjects or sitters, oftentimes men that Warhol had a crush on, people he was dating. And you can see that they're quite intimate and really reflect the image I just showed you before of someone lying on their bed in Warhol's interior. Next slide, please. And with the blotted line technique, what's incredible is that we find sort of queer male intimacy in these works. This is the 1950s, and Warhol would go on to actually try to exhibit this type of work. Next slide, please. And this is actually a work that's in Andy Warhol Revelation. You'll notice that blotted line technique. It's kind of like a broken line, but this is very different because Warhol is depicting two men. They're holding hands, and it really reflects Warhol as a queer man in New York in the 50s. He was hanging out in Serendipity 3, which was a very queer-friendly, gay-friendly ice cream parlor that's still...
Frozen hot chocolate, right?
Yeah, frozen hot chocolate. I think you can actually get it delivered through Amazon if you'd like some for your own happy hour this evening. But this work is actually in the show, and it really reflects that Warhol wasn't just making subject matter for clients, but he was actually making work for himself that was highly intimate. Next slide, please. Oh, good. Well, follow me, Jongwoo. We're going to go to another section. This is a section about iconic women. And the portraits that you're looking at there, that's Andy Warhol. Those were his last self-portraits made. And they're paired with two portraits of his mother, Julia, who died in 1972. And he would make portraits of her 2 years later. In this gallery, we also featured Jackie Kennedy, and we also feature Marilyn Monroe. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to you, Jongwoo.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Jose. Switching gears, let's look at some images of Marilyn Monroe. We're going to come back to these screen prints, but may we have the next slide, please? Yeah. So if you haven't seen this, don't be alarmed. This is in New York City at MoMA, but I thought it would give us nice starting point. This is done in 1962. So in the early 60s, our friend Andy started making images of American celebrities like Elvis Presley and, of course, Marilyn Monroe. And I want to spend a little time with this because I want to talk about the gold background, the idea of a permanence, and also an icon, especially in the context of the exhibition, which looks at the intersections of, shall we say, Warholian pleasure and spirituality as defined in a queer way, right? So, okay, so gold background icons often denote permanence, eternity, right? So it's about something holy and sublime, but American celebrity, oftentimes it doesn't last that long, So that juxtaposition of 20th century celebrity as an icon and its transience, when you juxtapose that transience with the kind of a permanence or eternity that gold can denote or connote, is very fascinating. And this particular face of a Monroe is actually based on one of her films, Niagara. It has the publicity still. And may I have the next slide? Maybe I have a source image.
Yeah, that's from our collection here in Pittsburgh.
And that is fabulous, so you can see that Andy spent some time trying to really distill the glory, the glamour of this beautiful woman. May I have the next slide, please? And about almost like two decades later, right? Warhol is revisiting this topic, and I was very sort of struck by the fragility and the constructiveness of the face of this famous woman and the transience of the celebrity, we're gonna take a look at individual screen print of the 4, but what I wanna particularly want us to think about is that about 2 decades later, when Andy revisited this subject matter, he decided to sort of render Marilyn a little unfamiliar, very alien to us. You know, you can kind of recognize the contours or the outlines, the silhouettes, but Andy seems to be having fun making this very strange. May I have the next slide, please? So here, it's very much submerged in darkness, right? So a very shadowy figure. May I have the next slide, please? And you can see here that Andy is really repeating the shapes of the lips. You know, we just saw a fabulous video of a makeup, you know, maquillage.
Yeah.
It was fun, wasn't it? And it really shows us that, you know, making face, you know, literally is a process and construction. And in a way, it's a construction on the surface, and it can be also very fragile. And we try to make it look seamless, but Andy seems to be going the other way, to making it more obvious, the fragility of it, how it is made up. Like instead of hiding the seams, you can see that it is a process of a sort of a pasting and patching, you know, kind of patchwork, and trying to locate the essence of a Marilyn, and her sort of a glamour becomes very precarious in a work like this. May I have the next slide, please? And here, it's almost as though that Marilyn Monroe is dissipating, really disintegrating into the surface of the rag paper. Rag paper means just, you know, cotton paper, but it's almost as though that Marilyn, instead of in the process of being made, we're seeing Marilyn being sort of in the process of being unmade, you know. And again, thinking about celebrity icon and holy icons as opposed to permanence or endurance, what you're seeing is sort of like the transient, fugitive nature of, I don't know, pleasure, you know, maybe, but then, you know, transience isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's fascinating that Andy is thinking about this and visualizing it. May I have the next slide, please? So here we are literally being washed away, you know, like Marilyn's face, you know, after perhaps a performance or a film shooting, whatever, the makeup is being removed. And when that glory of a makeup is removed, who is Marilyn Monroe? Who is Marilyn behind the scene, you know? And when you also connect this to Andy as an artist and his persona, this becomes that much more nuanced and layered. So it is fascinating for an art historian or a curator like us to think about this, you know, in 1978. All right, may I have the next slide, please? All right, so I think that we're walking through the galleries again.
Yeah, thank you, Jongwoo. I love that. You know, in this particular gallery, you know, Andy was often surrounded by death. His father died when he was a child, and it really was a lot of female figures that really supported him, but also impacted his life. He was shot in 1968 by the militant feminist Valerie Solanas, and so he knew death head on. And so it's incredible that he would depict someone like Marilyn. He depicted her in gold, the one that you just showed, right after, you know, 1962, immediately after she had died. Warhol had just gone through his, you know, death and disaster subject matter, and for me, it was quite haunting, as you discussed. The sort of the disintegration of this image, but you know, he started her off in gold, and the gold, of course, is very significant in Catholicism. And and we say icon a lot in today's culture. Everyone's an icon, from Beyonce to Taylor Swift, etc. But a true icon, you know, icon paintings are functional. They're a way to communicate to the heavens. But for me, I found these works very, very much as almost like a shroud, or very mournful. I don't know if you thought of that as well. They have a very somber effect, don't they?
Totally.
We're gonna move on. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to tiptoe through this gallery. This gallery is about light and shadow. Warhol did play with abstraction, so I really like those Marylands that you picked, Jongwoo. They're not as pop, they're not candy colored. They really are quite stark. And as we go through this gallery to the next slide, Warhol would continue to play with abstraction, but Warhol was not a man who was defined by a particular medium, or a discipline, so he often would explore with different things. Do you want to start off with the oxidized, or shall I?
Wait, you go?
No, I just wanted to mention, I'm going to hand the baton to you.
Okay.
But Warhol, the new catalog raisonné just came out, and Warhol, the catalog raisonné documents over 230 canvases of the oxidized works, and those are the works just on the. There's one of the works just on the right. This image is in the speed, and this is in a section called the Catholic Body. Catholicism, in particular, has a large emphasis on the human body and the heavenly body. We see it through the Virgin Mary, through Christ hanging off the cross, through Christ ascending into heaven. And so one of the things that are associated with Catholicism, one of the things that I talk about in the show, is body fluids. And of course, this is something that crosses over not only into being a person of faith, but also into artistic practices. So I'd like for you to continue this, Jongwoo. Do you want to next slide? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is the one we have in the exhibition Oxidation 1977 and 78. And don't be alarmed, urine is involved in making this work. So you have a linen, and then you apply copper paint, and then when you pee on it, that uric acid does this magical chemical reaction. It has chemical reaction with the copper surface, so that oxidation happens. So there's a lot of elements of sort of randomness, like art historians will call this aleatory painting, sort of like, deriving from surrealist legacy, whatnot. But I am particularly interested in this, as Jose mentioned, this idea of a bodily fluid, especially, carnality in Catholic context is extremely important, because the carnal, a lot happens with the carnal, right? And when you think about bodily fluid, in human history, we put a lot of meaning on different kinds of bodily fluid. Blood means something, tears, they mean something, and then sweat, all these have a lot of cultural meanings. Of course, these are sort of the nicer ones, but there's also vomit and then urine as well. But when you come to the kind of artistic space in which metaphors construct a different world, one bodily fluid can stand in for another bodily fluid, and that interpenetrability of carnality understood through bodily fluid is particularly interesting, especially in the context of Jose's fabulous exhibition. So we talked about shroud a little bit in relation to Marilyn Monroe, but in Catholicism, fabric, and carnality, they go way back. Think about sort of Sudarium of Oviedo, or the miraculous shroud of Turin. That's about the kind of a miraculous transfer of a Christ's image on a fabric. And that transfer is a transfer of carnality, somatic matter being transferred onto fabric. So there is an interesting sort of a historical connection here. May I have the next slide, please? So this one here, oxidation painting, is actually in a private collection in Germany, but this is one of my favorites by Warhol in the oxidation painting series. This is a huge painting. Check out the size. It often reminds me of a Japanese folding screens, and there's sort of like gold technique. And also, if you can sort of distance yourself from the idea of urine painting, right? If you just look at that opulence of the surface of this image, it's just fantastic. You know, I mean, Andy did talk about sort of the like landscape like quality in a lot of his oxidation paintings. And so 1978 is about what, 4 decades after the glory days of abstract expressionism, but in a way that Andy Warhol is revisiting that language of a machismo of people like Jackson Pollock with, you know, glory and fabulousness, right? Because did Andy pee on this himself? No, girl, no. He would hire, right? These gorgeous boys, by boys I mean young men.
Hire or procure, I think.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like men like Victor, and they will give them like, you know, 6-pack cases of beer, and then have them pee on these sort of copper painted linen canvases, you know, and they were so funny. He would call these men his collaborators, you know. So I mean, the whole process is sort of like really funny and deeply embedded in queer culture. But if you look at the image and the object, look at it. It just is incredibly beautiful and complex, and the nuances, right? The kind of obfuscation, transparency, and the layering. It is a gorgeous thing, you know. And also, it's kind of like very interesting, almost like the middle finger to Jack the Dripper, like, you know, Jackson Pollock, you know, like whatever you can do, I can do better, you know, kind of thing. So, where was I going with this? I think what I really want to say is that how hard to pinpoint Andy into one category, right? Here it seems like it's really departing from pop art. But again, back to Catholicism and certain yearning for the eternal or glory or fame or love and desire, whatnot, you're seeing the kind of sort of like supernatural, almost a magical quality in works like this. Do I have another slide of oxidation painting? No, can I go back and the one before? So this one is the one included in the exhibition, you know, and yeah, and Andy said that he wasn't really sure why it turns green sometimes and why it turns black sometimes, but he welcomed that chancy, random quality in it. And it's almost as though that, so you have this carnal matter sort of like, you know, added onto a canvas, and then what happens next is in the realm of nature, or perhaps something beyond nature. So I will stop right there. Jose, did you move on?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jongwoo. And I would just mention, the process itself, it was accidental, but Warhol, he basically learned by trial and error, and the participants were mostly male because he preferred how they sort of streaked their urine across these canvases. And, you know, the first
good times.
Yeah, and, you know, there was rumors that Jackson Pollock himself back in the 50s would urinate on paintings that he was selling to clients he hated. So literally, Andy's taking the piss out of, you know, abstraction. But also, these were shown 3 times during Warhol's actual life, and one time they were shown in Paris at the FIAC Art Fair, and this was in 1978. And the lamps it said that the lamps from the art fair were so hot that the paints were sweating. And Warhol said, "Oh, they remind you those religious statues that weep." And then it made me think about that. And you, of course, you hear about sort of religious statuary that sort of procures, you know, blood, sweat, tears, etc. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And in this section, the Catholic body, this Warhol also played with other, or he also experimented with other sorts of paint. And so in 1966, he did, for Playboy magazine, he did a woman's torso with blacklight activated paint. And so this is 1966. And so he would go on later in between 84 and 86 is making his Last Supper series, which is featured in Andy Warhol Revelation. This is a painting, it's about 17 feet long. It's at the speed, but it's blacklight activated. And so the lights change in the gallery every few minutes under black light, those purple tubes. And the painting basically has two lives. The life it has sort of under normal circumstances, and then the change it has when it's activated with this black light and it glows. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Oh, and so also in this gallery, there's also another painting that also has that phrase, be somebody with a body. And so if you can go back one. By this time, Warhol had been shot, and I mentioned, he had recovered, but he was often had to be very conscious of his health, and he would go on to die in 1987. But by the 80s, he was one of the first people to get into healing crystals. He continued to go to church, but he also was into physical fitness. This is one of his trainers, who is
very cute.
Yeah, and he's a bodybuilder, so it makes sense.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Warhol photographed this bodybuilder, and you can see behind him, the bodybuilder's name is Keith Peterson. But behind him, this is Warhol studio. You see one of the Last Supper paintings in process, but also Andy on one of his stationary bikes. Next slide, please. And next slide. Thank you. And so this painting, it's in the show, it's beautiful. It really overlaps and layers this content, sacred and secular. The be somebody with a body, you see this bodybuilder type man with this illuminated halo around him. It's appropriated from an ad. Warhol loved to take images from other sources. And so to take that and then to take it on another image he appropriated, which is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, or at least a version of Jesus Christ in a very Western style, young, handsome. And this Christ figure looks down and perhaps is trying to make eye contact with the bodybuilder here. But I really like these works because the black light one, I think of black light and its use for forensic scenes or the things that black light can reveal. And so for me, it is a true revelation in these particular works. For me, is it the queer body? Is it the body of desire? Is it the body of salvation and faith and heaven? And so I love how Warhol sort of fuses sacred and secular in this work. This is also work that's made in the 80s towards the end of Warhol's life. Warhol's Last Supper series would actually be his final body of work. It would exhibit in Milan, across the street, basically from the original mural made by Leonardo da Vinci. It would open in January of 1987. Warhol would pass away in February of 87, a month later. And so some people think this was really sort of his acknowledgement that he was going to pass. He was already in very poor health by then. But this painting for me really sort of exemplifies pop culture, but also really reveals sort of Warhol's queer side. And as I mentioned, Warhol, especially among his circle of friends, was very gay. He was out, he was open. But this body of work, I think, speaks even more so to audiences today. Next slide. Oh. So we have about 4 minutes left, Jongwoo. Do you want to comment on the painting we just saw and sort of the heavenly bodies and sort of bodies of desire?
Yeah, sure. Okay, sure. Could we go back to the previous slide? Yeah. So, I mean, I was very struck by the interaction between the two bodies, right? One holy body and one secular body. They both happen to be male, so that the homoeroticism is fascinating. And yet there's also the kind of sort of like pathos, because especially with a black lighting, in and out, they're not always together, right? There's always separation and coming together, so that there is that a little bit of sort of what should I call it? Pathos, a little sad, But I also like the fact that in a way that a Christ's body becomes a cradle for that muscular man's torso. It reminds me of actually Michelangelo's La Pietà.
Yeah, of course, which Warhol saw in 1964 at the World's Fair. He was showing just across in another pavilion with his 13 Most Wanted Men.
Yeah,
it has a lot of queer references and subtext.
Exactly, especially in relation to La Pietà, you know, Jesus is in place of Mary. So Mary was a Jesus and Jesus was a Mary, you know, that is also very interesting. And about being somebody with a body, you know, it sort of like makes you wonder about the importance of carnality in Catholicism also, but also the importance of having a body in gay culture, you know, and could we imagine being somebody without a body in gay culture, you know, or being nobody with a body, you know? So the play on these words, you know, I feel like touch upon not only on the idea of carnality and sin, but also a sort of a gay communities and the sexual economy of a desire, right, in the 80s. All right.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, yeah, I forgot to emphasize, you know, the somebody is underlined, and so is the body. And I mentioned this is the appropriated image. This is the image Warhol found. Thank you, Jongwoo. I forgot to mention we have a catalog for the exhibition.
Yes.
It's available in the Speed gift shop, I'm sure, along with other goodies. And I have one here that I'm holding.
Yes, I love too.
With the Warhol mug, I love that. But yeah, the exhibition, it's on view, Andy Warhol Revelation. It's on view through November 29th. And so I would encourage you to visit www.speedmuseum.org or check their social media out. I want to thank you, Jongwoo Kim, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen Riley and the team at the Speed for making tonight possible. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye, Louisville.